In approaching this issue, I've been influenced by two different experiences. One was obviously as a government minister responsible for funding a range of not-for-profit organisations in the ageing, employment and immigration portfolios. But equally significant has been my experience originally as an employee and then as a board member and volunteer in a number of not-for-profit bodies over more than 3 decades. Drawing on this experience, I would like to outline an approach to the not-for-profit sector, or civil society as I would prefer to name it. The description not-for-profit immediately connotes an economic framework, whereas civil society conveys a different, broader notion of which the economic is just one part. The Productivity Commission accepted this broader role for the sector and noted the tensions that arise from the conflict between the economic and other objectives. So I'd like to say something about my approach to civil society. And I do against this background that there are very few attractions of being in opposition politically, but one of them is that if you use the time well to reflect upon what's happened and what the challenges are in the future, it can lead to hopefully better outcomes in the future. The institutions of civil society are important because they are neither created nor controlled by the state. Public funding requires accountability and services require training, skills and a professional approach. But it is important, I believe, that the independence and the volunteering ethos of the sector is both protected and encouraged. We should guard against unnecessary state control of the civil sector. There is a danger, ladies and gentlemen, that government can seduce the community groups into becoming its mouthpiece. There is also a danger that the government will see the voluntary sector as simply an extension of itself. I was reminded of this concern when reading the speech of a former New Zealand government minister to a conference on social inclusion here in Melbourne. In it, Steve Mahoney, now the Vice-Chancellor of Massey University at Palmerston North in New Zealand, and formerly a New Zealand government minister for 9 years, said this, and I quote, "Community organisations have to accept that they must have professional management and rely less on volunteers. Volunteering is still vital, but the core of a community group of any size needs to be paid and accountable. Secondly, he said, there are too many community groups. While new groups will always appear in response to a need, if real progress is to be made, rationalisation of numbers is essential. Thirdly, local communities need volunteer centres where induction and training can be provided. And fourthly, there has to be full funding of the work community groups are asked to do." Now, while aspects of these statements are unremarkable, taken together, they raise, I think, a concern. There is a sense in these remarks that the voluntary sector is viewed as another arm of government, to be directed, regulated and funded like an agency of the state. The essence of the third or voluntary sector of civil society is that individuals gather together to address issues that they perceive in need of response. Most often this has been at a local level. Surely there cannot be too many community groups. The suggestion that there are smacks of a command approach and bureaucratic control. One only has to look to Britain to see how non-government organisations can morph into quasi-government organisations. According to the National Council for Voluntary Organisations, 25,000 British charities receive more than 3/4 of their funding from government. Having courted a new constituency of charitable organisations, the danger is that government can politicise the partnership to the point of crudely suggesting that only support for the party in government will maintain massive levels of funding. When the civil sector accepts this arrangement, it's effectively lost its own independence. What does it matter if civic and charitable organisations become arms of government? A blending of the role of government and the civil sector risks the domination of the government over all other spheres. Do not forget that every state power tends to look upon all liberty with a suspicious eye, warned the Dutch statesman Abraham Kuyper. He went on, "The ancient history of all people replays a shameful spectacle. Despite stubborn, sometimes heroic struggle, the freedom of the spheres dies out and state power becomes Caesarism triumphs," unquote. When the state directs the activity of civil society, it enfeebles the ability of citizens to take responsibility for their own community and society. And the practical outcome is all too familiar. A one-size-fits-all approach to social problems, ensnared by contractual obligations designed to fit government silos, which rob much of the individual initiative and personal initiative that should motivate charitable activity. Worse, it endangers the vibrancy of the institutions that help to form citizens in the virtues. The act of giving, whether finances, services or counsel, becomes a professional activity and a function of the state, rather than an act of charity and love directed to fellow human beings. Now, this is not to say that the state has no role in other spheres of society. Rather, it is to argue that free citizens should ensure that the state is an enabler of other spheres of human activity, not a master of them. The Coalition will remain mindful to this warning when assessing the government's approach to the productivity's recommendations. However, it is pleasing to note that the Commission has recognised these tensions, albeit expressed in different language. Ladies and gentlemen, last year I announced that the Coalition in government would simplify the relationship between government, the Commonwealth, and family relationship program service providers. What I said then is pertinent to this discussion, so let me repeat it. Government contractual and reporting requirements cost family service agencies sufficient sums of money to administer. Much data is collected, but little of it is ever used. Many agencies have multiple contracts with government with different requirements, different obligations and different reporting conditions. The Coalition supports transparency and accountability in the use of taxpayers' funds, but it also supports simplicity and efficiency. Accordingly, we should simplify the reporting and contractual arrangements for family service agencies. In particular, we should implement one contract with the department for each agency instead of multiple contracts. Negotiate the content of the contracts with the agencies rather than simply imposing it upon them. Replace the current system of rolling audits with an initial benchmarking audit and such further spot audits that are required from time to time. Simplify the reporting requirements to an annual financial return, an annual governance return, and simple quarterly data return for each agency, and support transparency by requiring agencies in receipt of government funding to place on their website details of all expenditure of government funds where the item of expenditure exceeds a certain amount. The style of this reporting would be discussed with the family service agencies before being implemented. These changes, as I said at the time, would save on expenditure for both the department and the agencies. In particular, it would obviate the need for the costly, time-consuming FRSP Online, that is the Families Department data collection system. The measures would reduce reporting requirements by an estimated 90%, and the significant savings generated by agencies through the implementation of this measure could be retained by them for the provision of services. This stands in stark contrast to what I see as the developments occurring at the present time. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude. While these remarks were directed to family relationship agencies specifically, they indicate our approach to the appropriate relationship between government and civil society organisations in receipt of government funds more generally. While time this morning does not permit a detailed point-by-point response to the Productivity Commission, I hope that these remarks give you some understanding of our thinking about the aspects of the important work that you do for our society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And thank you for redefining the sector as the sector for civil society. It's a much better terminology than the third sector or the not-for-profit sector, and it's very interesting that you made that remark in relation to taking things out of the economic paradigm. It was very much part of the discussion in yesterday's part of the conference as well.